The rain showed no signs of stopping. I sat in the front passenger seat, watching the storm rage outside. This was no ordinary rain. It was a downpour so heavy that I couldn't see more than 20 yards ahead. I realized there was no point in trying to leave today. I was stuck here. In my soaked clothes, the cold was unbearable. I was freezing, and I knew that if I didn't figure something out, I'd be facing hypothermia. Even hot tea from my thermos wasn't helping. The only option was to return to that house, try to light a fire in the stove, dry my clothes, and wait out the storm. But my gut instinct was screaming at me not to go back there. I hesitated, unable to make a decision, even though I knew it was the only right choice in this situation. Finally, as night began to fall, I pushed myself to move. The rain had eased up a bit, but it hadn't stopped. I grabbed my backpack, a thermos, a small blanket, and a pillow. From the trunk, I pulled out a piece of old tarp and an axe. I figured it would be a good idea to board up the house's windows for safety. So I also took a hammer, pliers, and a can of old nails. Wading through the mud and puddles, I made my way to the house that looked even more ominous in the fading light. Searching for another option wasn't an option. I didn't have the time. By the time I reached the house, I was soaked again. I was shivering, my teeth chattering uncontrollably from the cold. The temperature was dropping fast, and it was still early spring. The first thing I did was use the axe to break open the corner of the floor. I chopped up some old boards into smaller pieces and stacked them in the stove. I poured the last bit of lighter fluid I had over the wood, waited a minute, then struck a match and tossed it in. The fire roared to life, filling the house with light and warmth. My mood lifted immediately. Outside, the storm raged on, but the roof, surprisingly, wasn't leaking. I kept chopping up more of the rotting floorboards and carried the worst pieces to the stove, the sturdier boards I used to cover the windows. It took me about half an hour to finish. The fire grew stronger, spreading heat throughout the room. I did my best to avoid looking at the portrait on the stove and covered it with some long planks of wood. That felt much better. Within another half hour, I had boarded up all 4 windows and the front door. It was now warm inside the house. I stripped down to my underwear, wrapped myself in a blanket, and made a makeshift bench out of some boards to sit in front of the stove. It felt incredible. Warmth. My clothes lay on the stove, drying on a piece of tarp. Outside, the rain finally stopped, but it was completely dark now. My stomach growled. I had nothing for dinner except tea and a half-eaten pack of oatmeal cookies. This was the first time in 2 years of scavenging scrap metal that I'd been in a situation like this. So, I had tea and cookies for dinner. Delightful. 2 hours later, my clothes were dry and I got dressed. It felt amazing. The room was warm, though the smell of mold and rot lingered. The fire's glow flickered on the walls, casting strange shadows. My phone was down to 30% battery, and I had no signal, not even a single bar. Great. I spread out the blanket on the stove, added more wood to the fire, and lay down. It was warm and dry, and exhaustion pulled me under within 20 minutes. I woke up to a heavy thud against the front door. The house was dark but still warm. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room, illuminating the corners, walls, and ceiling. Maybe it was just a dream. Then came another heavy thud against the door. I felt my heart start to pound, and I grabbed the axe, stepping off the stove. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. There was no response. No footsteps, no crunching of leaves or branches, no sound of breathing, nothing. I stirred the ashes in the stove, finding a few glowing embers. I blew on them, added some small twigs, and watched in relief as they caught fire. I added more wood, forcing the flames to grow stronger. Then came a third thud against the door, so loud that I dropped the flashlight. "Who's there? Answer me!" I shouted. I picked up the flashlight and shone it directly on the door, seeing the boards I had nailed up from the inside. I held the axe tight in my right hand, ready for anything. I stepped closer, peering through a small gap between the boards. Nothing. Without even realizing it, I lowered the axe, pulled out the cross from around my neck, kissed it, and made the sign of the cross 3 times. I stood there listening. I would have heard someone if they were outside, but I was certain there was no one there. So who or what was banging on the door? I backed away slowly, returning to the stove. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. I sat down on the makeshift bench, staring into the flames. Sleep was the last thing on my mind now. The clock on my wrist read 2:15 a.m. Then a loud bang shook the wall behind me. I jumped to my feet, gripping the axe and flashlight. Another thud, this time closer to the window I had boarded up. "Who's there?" I yelled again. Silence. A third bang, this time against the window itself. I knew the rotting boards wouldn't hold for long, but who was doing this? I stood there waiting for the next impact. 5 minutes passed, 10, 20, but no more bangs came. I finally sat back down near the stove, tossing more wood into the flames. Then another loud bang shook the opposite wall, and I jumped up again. I shone my flashlight around the room, axe held at the ready. Another bang came, this time closer to the first window. I waited, heart pounding. Then came the third bang, this one so close that I could almost feel it through the boards. I stood there waiting for whatever would happen next. But once again, the room fell silent. The pattern was repeating itself, but why? I sat on the bench trying to think clearly. What was going on here? Who was behind all of this? I threw more wood into the stove and sat back down on the makeshift bench. This time I faced the room, my back to the stove, keeping a wary eye on the walls and the eerie shadows dancing across them. It felt like I was losing my mind. My watch showed 3:13 a.m., and I knew there was no way I'd be able to sleep until dawn. The fear was too strong. Something, or someone, was tormenting me, but I didn't know what. And that uncertainty terrified me more than anything else. I sat there for over 40 minutes, my eyes growing heavy despite the fear. Nothing else happened. It was almost dawn, and I knew that as soon as the sun came up, I would leave this place, get my Land Cruiser out of the ditch, and never come back. I didn't care about the scrap metal anymore. I just wanted out. Then I heard a soft rustling behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, and watched as the boards I had used to cover the portrait fell to the floor. The man's face stared back at me, and this time, he was smiling. I could have sworn there was no smile the first time I saw that portrait, but now there was a twisted, malicious grin on that face. It felt like the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Those eyes, it felt like they were watching me. I made the sign of the cross. A violent thud hit the door, and my nerves were shot. The flashlight in my hand trembled as I shone it on the door. What the hell was this? I yelled, "Get out of here!" But another heavy blow struck the door, even harder this time. My hands shook, and I shouted again, "Leave me alone! Get lost!" I was torn between two choices: tear down the boards and make a run for my truck, or stay in the house, keep warm by the fire, and wait for daylight. Going outside was a huge risk. Who or what was out there? As I wrestled with indecision, a wind howled down the chimney, and the fire roared to life, burning brighter and hotter. Smoke poured out of cracks in the stove, and I froze in terror. The room began to fill with smoke, and the fire blazed even wilder, as if possessed. Panic clawed at me. What should I do? I dropped to my knees, made the sign of the cross, and began praying, poorly, using bits and pieces of what I could remember. I felt like I was being watched. The wind suddenly died down, the fire in the stove burned lower, and the smoke stopped pouring out. Tears filled my eyes as I whispered, "Thank you, God, thank you." I stayed on my knees staring at the glowing embers in the stove. The house was plunged back into darkness, except for the steady glow of my flashlight. I was too afraid to put more wood into the fire. The smell of smoke lingered, but it wasn't choking me. I sat with my back to the stove, sweeping the flashlight's beam across the walls, floor, and ceiling. I could feel it. Someone or something was in the house with me. I turned the light onto the portrait, and another wave of terror washed over me. The face had changed again. The grin was gone, replaced by a look of cold, twisted anger. I made the sign of the cross again. What was this? What kind of nightmare was I trapped in? If anything else happened, I was sure I'd lose my mind. My sanity was already hanging by a thread, but until dawn, nothing else happened. As soon as daylight broke, I ripped the boards off the door. With the axe in hand, I cautiously stepped outside, scanning my surroundings. I slowly made my way back to my Land Cruiser, constantly looking over my shoulder. I worked with a level of desperation and speed I had never felt before, determined to get my truck out of the ditch. Within half an hour, I was ready to leave, even though the road was nothing but a mud pit. I didn't care. I'd rather get stuck in the forest or in the middle of a field than spend another minute near that cursed place. My Land Cruiser seemed to understand my fear and determination. It powered through the mud like a tank, flinging dirt in all directions. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and the truck lurched and skidded, but it kept moving. I drove through the forest, across the field, and finally reached a real road. I had never experienced a more intense off-road drive, and my truck had never been so filthy. But it had proven itself. It had gotten me out of that cursed, haunted place. As I entered the city, I stopped at a self-service car wash and spent a long time cleaning the mud off my truck. I wanted to wash away every trace of that nightmare. I finally returned home to my cozy country house, peeled off my muddy clothes, and threw them into the washing machine. Only when I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror did I realize the full impact of what I'd been through. Almost all my hair had turned gray overnight. I showered, ate some leftover soup, and poured myself a glass of vodka. I drank it, savoring the warmth, and went to bed. I was exhausted, drained both physically and mentally. I felt like I had aged years in a single horrifying night. But as I walked into my bedroom, my heart stopped. On the wall near the wardrobe was the same portrait, the same angry face staring back at me, even more twisted and cruel than before. Beneath it were the words, "I will haunt you until the end of your days." The door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around in fear. When I turned back, the portrait was gone. In its place stood the man himself.